Welcome back, everyone. And for the first time today, we're having a panel session. The first panel is entitled Churchill and Scotland. And the chair for this session is someone that needs absolutely no introduction to us, Alan Packwood. For anyone who doesn't know, a fellow of Churchill College, Cambridge, and is the director of the Churchill Archives Centre. And I can't think of anyone more qualified to chair this session. Alan will introduce the panellists, and we'll have a small presentation piece by each panellist, and then he will chair the panel session, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Alan.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I don't know about being qualified to chair this panel, because I expect you're all sitting there wondering why you have an Englishman, and a Southern Englishman at that, chairing a panel in Edinburgh on Churchill and Scotland. The short answer is that I've been parachuted in. The original chair for this panel was going to be Alistair Stewart, a genuine Scot and a great defender of Churchill in the often otherwise hostile Scottish press. Unfortunately, Alistair had to step back because of health issues, but I'm delighted to say that he's escaped from his hospital bed and he's been able to join us this morning, and he's sitting just over there, so hope you can join me in wishing Alistair well. So, in my defence, though I'm not a Scot, this is not an entirely new subject to me, because in 1999, as a young, naive, green archivist, I was lucky enough to co-curate an exhibition with the National Library of Scotland, just a few blocks from here, which looked at Churchill's many Scottish connections. And as you heard from Scott at the beginning of today, those connections were lifelong, literally lifelong, because they start with birth. Churchill was born on the 30th of November, 1874. The 30th of November, St Andrew's Day, St Andrew being the patron saint of Scotland. And if we can have the first slide. It's often forgotten that for over 14 formative years, between 1908 and 1922, Churchill was a Scottish MP. He was the Liberal MP for the East Coast Scottish city of Dundee. And initially, at least, he was accused by some of being parachuted in from England. But he won several elections, and he represented the city for a period of great social change and upheaval. And just thinking back to the first presentation today, it was a period, certainly during which he was a determined free trader, and a period during which he was First Lord of the Admiralty. Also a period during which he took a Scottish bride. This is Clementine Hosier, this amazing photograph, beautiful photograph, taken at around about the time of their marriage in 1908. And of course, he also commanded a Scottish battalion in the field in Belgium, the 6th Battalion Royal Scots Fusiliers. And here he is with some of his fellow officers, some of whom would later occupy positions of prominence in Scottish politics. So, by the time of the First World War, Churchill could and did say of Scotland, "You know, I am a very great admirer of that race. A wife, a constituency, and now a regiment attest the sincerity of my choice." There were, of course, moments where he may have felt a little bit more discerning, and I'm going to quote from a letter that survives in Clementine Churchill's papers, and it's a letter that Winston sent her from the Queen's Hotel in Dundee on the 17th of October 1909, and it captures perhaps a certain culture shock on arriving in Dundee. Churchill wrote, "This hotel is a great trial to me. Yesterday morning, I'd half eaten a kipper when a huge maggot crept out and flashed his teeth at me. Today, I could find nothing nourishing for lunch but pancakes. Such are the trials which great and good men endure in the service of their country." But at least he could wash it down with some Scottish whiskey. Now, today, as many of you will be aware, Scottish nationalist politicians in particular regularly criticise Churchill and imply that he was an English politician who was foisted upon, as they would see it, their country. As I hope we're going to show in this panel, the truth is inevitably far more nuanced and far more complex than that. A lot of the focus is on, has been in the past, on Churchill losing the election in Dundee in 1922. But that, of course, ignores the fact that he won in Dundee in 1908, in 1910 twice, and in 1918. It is also, of course, true that after the Second World War, he lost the British general election of 1945. But if you look at this photograph, this is how Churchill was received here in Edinburgh in June 1945 by huge crowds. And this photograph is taken just round the corner from here. This is Churchill speaking in Princes Street Gardens. So you can see there's a lot for us to explore in the single hour available to us. And we're very lucky to have an expert panel to help us separate fact from fiction and to guide us through some of these controversies and contradictions. So we have Andrew Liddle, Sonia Purnell, and Neil McLennan. I'm going to introduce each one of them in turn. They're going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have questions at the end. So we're going to go straight into it, and let's start with Andrew. Andrew Liddle has established himself as a leading Scottish journalist and political commentator. He's previously served as political correspondent for the Press and Journal, one of Scotland's best-selling daily newspapers, and as a chief reporter for the Courier. Like Churchill, he's moved from reporting on events to chronicling them. And his book, Cheers, Mr. Churchill, is a really brilliant and colourful and evocative account of Churchill's time as MP for Dundee. It brings Dundee and its personalities in the early 20th century to life, and it explains the concerns and issues of those days in a way that's really accessible to a modern audience. So I recommend it to you. Andrew.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Alan, for that very extremely generous introduction. I'd just like to begin also by paying tribute to Alistair Stewart. I'm really sorry you couldn't be on the panel today, but I think more than anyone, Alistair has fought for Churchill's reputation in Scotland, has enhanced Churchill's reputation in Scotland, and I think we all owe him a great deal of gratitude and are in his debt for that effort. I'm sure, speaking to a room of Churchill aficionados, you'll all be at least a little bit familiar with the kind of chronology of events that Alan has touched on there. Churchill's dramatic, career-saving by-election victory in Dundee in 1908. A further by-election victory in Dundee in 1917, which I think is perhaps one of the most significant of Churchill's election victories, because it cast away the aspersions that had gathered around him following the Dardanelles and that Randolph alluded to yesterday evening. You'll also probably be aware of this figure of Edwin Scrymgeour, Churchill's great rival in Dundee, a socialist, firebrand, prohibitionist who challenged Churchill at every election that he contested in Dundee. In 1908, Scrymgeour lost his deposit, but of course, as you'll also know, by 1922, Scrymgeour went on to defeat Churchill, and in doing so became the first, I should say, to date only, prohibitionist elected to the House of Commons. So I thought, rather than taking you through that in the kind of short space of time I have, that I'd rather just focus on two specific themes. Churchill as a constituency MP, particularly what he was like representing Dundee, what he was like as an advocate for the city, and then some of the formative relationships that Churchill built as well with people in Dundee. And I think that would be useful to understand what he meant to the city, but also to challenge some of the negative and misleading and mythologized narratives that have developed in recent years about his time in the city. Now, Alan's already mentioned the famous letter to Clementine complaining about the hospitality at the Queen's Hotel, which, by the way, I should say is still there if you want to visit, although it's a Best Western, so I don't know if the food will have improved massively. But it was fun, actually, when I was doing the research for the book, I looked at Churchill's receipts for his stays in Dundee, which are in the archive. And I was able to work out that he spent about as much on dinners, cigars, hot baths, champagne, as he did on the hotel room stays themselves. So I think he did try to have a good time, even if perhaps the standards weren't what he expected. But certainly that letter, I think, has contributed to a perception, perhaps, that Churchill had a difficult relationship with Dundee. There's also some other evidence from the kind of more political side of things from his constituency office. He could have quite a robust relationship with his constituents. This is one letter that was written by his office, I think probably by Eddie Marsh in 1917, in reply to a constituent who had suggested that we should have an early peace with Germany. And Churchill's office wrote, "I'm desired by Mr. Churchill to say, in answer to your letter, while taking every allowance for your strong feelings, he considers your letter wanting in both moderation and charity. He desires me to return it to you in order that you may reread it in light of this observation and see how far it conforms to those ideals you profess to serve." So quite a robust way of dealing with your electors. But actually, I think the important thing when we're looking at things like that in the Clementine letter is, of course, these are the exceptions that prove the rule, that actually Churchill was a very determined and forceful advocate for Dundee during his time as MP, and that was on both a macro and a micro level. On a macro level, for instance, he was a great enthusiast for the city's jute industry, which was the predominant industry in Dundee at that time. And that manifested itself not just in support for the jute barons, the jute bosses, but also for the people that worked in the jute mills as well. And indeed, legislation that Churchill brought forward as part of the Liberal government was so effective in raising the wages of jute workers that actually by 1921 he was having to lobby the cabinet to try and get it scrapped because it was going to kind of shut down the industry. So he was a really effective advocate for the city and its workers. But he was also an effective advocate in sort of smaller areas where you might think that someone like Churchill perhaps wouldn't take an interest. And for instance, in 1912, a great year, of course, of international crisis, Churchill had a voluminous correspondence to try and secure a new set of artillery pieces for the Dundee Boys Brigade. And that's just a kind of example, I think, of someone who cares for the constituency and who cares for all the organisations and people in it. And I think, of course, if you want the ultimate evidence of Churchill's effectiveness as a constituency MP, you need to only look at his electoral record in Dundee, which was 5 election victories, including in 1918, one of the biggest majorities in the country. You don't get that kind of record, I'm afraid, despite what some Scottish nationalists might say, if you treat your constituents with contempt. The second theme I just very briefly want to touch on is Churchill's formative relationships in Dundee. Now, we're very lucky to have Sonia here on the panel to talk about not just the most formative Scottish relationship, but probably the most formative relationship of Churchill's life in Clementine. But to touch briefly on two others that I think are important in terms of his time in Scotland. The first is Sir George Ritchie, who was the Dundee Liberal Association chairman. Ritchie was absolutely instrumental in securing the Dundee nomination for Churchill in 1908 and thereby effectively saving his cabinet career. He became his eyes and ears in the constituency, but also a very, very close friend and valued advisor on kind of general political issues as well. And on Ritchie's death in late 1921, Churchill described him in a beautiful obituary, which I would urge you all to read. One of the things Churchill said was he was the greatest friend anyone could ever have. And I think that's a good example of how Churchill really built bonds with people in Dundee. But the next formative relationship, I think, was one that surprised me the most, and that was with Edwin Scrimgeour himself, this socialist, prohibitionist, Christian evangelical, is probably not someone you would think would have that much in common with Winston. But actually, over the years and over their time contesting the Dundee seat, they did develop, and Churchill developed, I think, a begrudging respect for Scrymgeour. Scrymgeour lost his deposit in 1908. He was routinely humiliated by Churchill at the ballot box, but yet he kept going, and he fought on in the face of adversity and slowly built his support. And Churchill would say, after his defeat in 1922 at Scrymgeour's hands, "In Mr. Scrymgeour's victory, you see the victory of a man who stood for endurance and also for moral, orderly conceptions of democratic reform and action. You will find Mr. Scrymgeour will have a useful part to play in representing Dundee, where there is such fearful misery, distress, and such an awful contrast between one class and another." And that's not just a kind of one-off remark after his defeat. Indeed, several years before that, in 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, Scrymgeour extraordinarily turned up there to try and cover the conference as a journalist, but didn't have any of the proper accreditation or anything. And he actually turned to Churchill, who was there for a week, for help. And not only did Churchill get him his long-term political rival in Dundee, not only did Churchill get him the accreditation and the access that he needed, but he also lent him the use of his car and his driver so that he could complete his assignment as well. And I think that shows not just the kind of sort of magnanimity and largesse that we can see throughout Churchill's life, but I also think it shows the strength of feeling he had even for his bitterest political opponents in Dundee, and how he was willing to support people from the city in very different circumstances. So I hope those two examples perhaps shed a bit of light on Churchill's relationship with Dundee, perhaps have informed a bit of your knowledge about his relationship with Scotland, but also ultimately have helped challenge some of those misconceptions that exist, and I know we're going to talk about later this morning. Thank you.
Okay, Andrew, that was absolutely excellent there. And those, as he said, are just two examples, and there's plenty more in the book. So do check that out. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Sonia Purnell, also a great journalist, writer, historian, already known to many of you as the author of Clementine, The Life of Mrs. Winston Churchill, which, when it was published, was chosen as Book of the Year by both the Telegraph and the Independent newspapers over here in the UK. So there's no one better to tell us about Clementine's Scottish links and how they shaped both her and Winston. I would say that Sonia is now working on a biography of another Churchill woman, of Pamela Harriman, which is going to come out next September. I've had a sneak preview of a little bit of it and has access to wonderful new material, which has only just opened. So I suspect you may be coming back to talk to us again in the near future. Sonia.
Well, thank you very much, and I do hope to come back and talk to you about Pamela, who's very much in my mind right now. She has been a most extraordinary person to research, I can tell you. But Clementine was, such a big subject for me when I first started writing about her, and was constantly surprising to me, really, just how important she was in Churchill's life. And in fact, of course, as Alan referred to earlier, Churchill talked about having a Scottish constituency, a Scottish regiment, and a Scottish wife. And my humble opinion is that it was his Scottish wife who was the most permanent feature in his life, and also the most influential. And her Scottishness comes into that in a big way, by the way. But just to sort of show you how influential, those of you who haven't read the book, that she was in everything that he did from when they got married in 1908. On the date of their 40th wedding anniversary, they were in the south of France in 1948. They always had separate bedrooms, by the way, and he slipped a little note under her bedroom door Incredibly touching note, please do read it. But in that note, he thanks her for many years of happiness in a world of accident and storm. But he also says that he could not have done any of the work of his life without her. And I think that is absolutely, if you look into that marriage, you realise it wasn't just a marriage, very strong though that was, through all sorts of ups and downs, as you can imagine, but it was also a political coalition. She was always to the left of him. When he re-ratted after going back from the Liberals to the Conservatives, she did her duty as his wife, of course, and never failed in that, but she was always, in her heart and inclinations, a Liberal. And probably quite a lot of that was from her Scottish background. Not that she was born in Scotland, by the way. She was born in haste on the drawing room floor in the family house in Grosvenor Street in central London. Her mother was Lady Blanche Hosier, her mother being the daughter of the 10th Earl of Airlie, the family seat being, and there's some debate about exactly how to pronounce it, so Scots present, please forgive me, is either Cortachy Castle or Cortachy Castle. Please come and see me afterwards if you have the correct answer, because I would really like to know, which apparently is haunted by a drummer, should you want to go and see it. It's very romantic looking and exactly what you would want from a Highland castle. Anyway, so Lady Blanche was the daughter of the 10th Earl of Airlie, and she was a bit of a Victorian wild child, and they married her off in some haste to one Colonel Hosier, who was a divorced man from Glasgow, who had a fortune, a self-made fortune. He was a landed gentry, but the last generations, they had risen from sort of commerce, really, so very different background to her. Unfortunately, that marriage wasn't very happy. It wasn't happy at all. And it's most likely that when Clementine was born, he already knew that he was most unlikely to be her father, or indeed the father of any of Lady Blanche's 4 children. Lady Blanche, discovering that Colonel Hosier was not the agreeable husband that she'd hoped for, entertained herself quite widely. They do say, and I remain to this day full of admiration and awe, that she entertained up to 10 lovers at once. So this is a woman of great energy and determination. So Clementine is almost certainly half English. She was almost certainly the daughter of the first Baron Redesdale, otherwise known as the grandfather of the famous Mitford sisters. He also happened to be married to Lady Blanche's sister, who was called Clementine. So whether or not Clementine's name was a thank you to her sister, history doesn't tell us. But going back to the Airlies, very interesting family with a history of all sorts of Scottish occupations, including castle burnings, Jacobite rebellions, martyrdoms, and assorted other exciting things. But I think it was the 12th Earl of Airlie you might have seen in the 5th series of The Crown. Sorry, the 13th Earl of Airlie, forgive me, and indeed the film The Queen, where in the film The Queen he is seen planning the funeral of Princess Diana, and in the 5th series of The Crown he's seen organising the wedding of the Waleses. So this family is extremely well connected, both royally and otherwise. But let's get back to Clementine being born on the floor of the drawing room floor of Grosvenor Street. She then spent some of her childhood in Scotland, and that was when she had her first early testing experiences. Life with Lady Blanche was not easy. There wasn't much money. Colonel Hosier was not inclined to pay much in the way of alimony, so they quite often had to escape various irate bailiffs wanting to be paid for things. But her mother also much preferred her elder daughter, Kitty, and didn't make any bones about this at all. So Clementine was a rather sort of tearful, fearful child. I really feel for her, actually. She was rather overlooked, wasn't thought to be pretty or clever, and rather relied on a dog, a pet poodle called Carlo. And I'm afraid to report that one day when Clementine was going away from the family house in Alice at the time, Carlo tried to follow her, Clementine probably rather eager to have Carlo with her, and Carlo fell under the wheels of the train, and that was the end of Carlo. And I'm afraid Clementine told her children that she remembers never quite getting over the loss of such a dear friend. She was quite a timid child. It didn't help that Colonel Hosier was a very scary man indeed. And on one occasion, when Lady Blanche took her children off to live in Dieppe in northern France, a rather convenient step away from the bailiffs, Colonel Hosier actually tried to kidnap them. He didn't succeed because of Clementine's quick thinking, but he wasn't an easy man, and nor was her grandmother, who believed very much that young girls, women, should be very ladylike in their pursuit. So even croquet was forbidden on, and Clementine had to play her croquet games behind the gardener's cottage so as not to be observed by her grandmother. So there was quite a lot of upset turmoil in her life, a lot of, moving around, no real sense of security, no financial security, no family security. And then she met Winston Churchill. I'm sure you know the first time they met was in 1904 at a ball. And Winston asked to be introduced to this beautiful woman. She really was staggering. I don't think any photograph quite captures that, because if you read the contemporary accounts, people say she was the most radiant being they'd ever seen. Anyway, Churchill himself obviously thought so, asked to be introduced to her by Jenny, his mother, went up to her, and then this great wordsmith was struck dumb. Couldn't think of a single thing to say. Well, she thought he was positively weird. Why would you just go up to someone and stand there and not say anything? And was very pleased when her friend whisked her off onto the dance floor, and they didn't speak again for 4 years. And then a sort of series of sliding door accident things meant that they met 4 years later at a dinner, where they discovered they shared interest in everything. I mean, Clementine was of a generation where young women weren't really encouraged to follow politics, great affairs of state, world affairs, geopolitics, but she loved it, encouraged by some spinster aunts who were quite intellectual. Churchill had never found a woman who shared these interests, who found them exciting. Well, so they were at this dinner party, didn't stop talking all evening. Everyone else was talking about them. They'd never seen anything quite like this before, and they were married a few months later. At which point, of course, as we've already heard, Churchill got his seat in Dundee, which was all rather convenient because that is very close to Cortachy Castle. Now he had a Scottish wife that he could parade in Dundee, a very beautiful Scottish wife. This was very helpful politically. And over the next few elections there, she turns out again and again, even when she is pregnant with her second child, she goes campaigning for Churchill. And this isn't always an easy experience, by the way. We've already heard about, there was a sort of great difference, wealth gap we call it now, in Dundee. There were the jute workers, there were some wealthy people, but there was a lot of hardship in Dundee. And it wasn't always easy at hustings and meetings. But Clementine would go along sometimes in Churchill's place in 1917 when he was appointed munitions minister after his resurrection following the Dardanelles. The custom then was if you became a minister, you had to be re-elected, can you imagine? And so he was rather busy, funny enough, munitions, First World War, that kind of thing. So she came up and did a lot of campaigning for him, and there was a lot of barracking and hectoring. She was a young woman, as I've just said, quite timid young woman who had to dig deep and find confidence in dealing with the hecklers, in understanding perhaps why they were heckling, what it was they were heckling about. And she developed this rather interesting and hugely successful technique of saying, I can't quite hear you. Would you like to come closer and tell me what it is that you want to say? Well, that rather diffuses the situation and makes it much more pleasant and constructive. This wasn't, however, such a successful technique. Later on another occasion, she arrived, perhaps slightly unwisely, wearing a very beautiful set of pearls in a particularly, deprived neighbourhood, and I'm afraid she was spat on one occasion. An observer saying even then she maintained a magnificent bearing, describing her ordeal as like being an aristocrat going to the guillotine in the French Revolution in a tumbrel, which is a cart or something. So she maintained an amazing dignity, and that's what you need to understand about Clementine, is that sometimes she could appear fearful, but inside there was this core of steel, which got steelier and steelier with time, and certainly her experiences in Dundee helped that. And in the 1922 election, that was particularly tough. And she would be often there on her own because Churchill was either ill, like he was in 1922, or busy doing other things, like he was in 1917. And it is that political coalition that is so interesting. And I think that marriage did so much for Churchill. I mean, as I've already said, he appreciated that looking back. Her beliefs, I think, made him more of a more nuanced politician than he might otherwise have been. We've already heard about how he cared for his constituents, and I do believe that is true, but I do believe that Clementine was in part responsible because of the life that she'd had. Lady Blanche often literally had no money, and what she did have, she might go and gamble in the casino in Dieppe in northern France, much to Clementine's absolute dismay. Okay. And, you know, throughout her life, she really, really disliked gambling. And so, sorry, I lost my thread there. So she wanted to introduce him to what it was like to be outside his gilded circle. Remember, he never went on the tube, I think, despite what that film showed you. That's absolute rubbish. He went on it once, I think, and had to be rescued. And I'm not sure he ever went on a bus. And I don't think he carried money around. I mean, this is not the childhood that Clementine had had. So she was a great influence on his life, on his understanding of people not from his gilded circle. And part of that very much came from her Scottish upbringing, of which she was very proud. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. You know you have a great panel when your challenge as a chairman is actually to have to cut people. I feel awful for cutting people off, but there'll be time for some more questions and discussion in a moment. We're going on to our third and final speaker. So Dr. Neil McLennan, a director of management consultancy, an active politician in northern Scotland. Neil was the director of leadership studies at the Centre for Global Security and Governance at Aberdeen University. He's a former history teacher, an established writer and speaker, and as far as Churchill is concerned, he's also become, as we're about to find out, an expert mythbuster. And he's going to look in his talk at some of the more contested areas of Churchill's legacy in Scotland, not least whether he abandoned the 51st Highland Division at St Valery in June 1940. And Neil is eminently qualified to talk on this subject. He's lectured at Sandhurst, and he is an honorary colonel of two Highlanders, which means that he's well capable of keeping our hussars in order, I think. Neil.
Alan, thank you very, very much for the warm words. And how do you follow the various presentations that we've had already today? Absolutely fantastic. So if I can just give some thanks, I really want to give some thanks. Captain Hendricks, what a wonderful but very worrying lecture to start off, but what an inspired choice to bring together Churchill, Scotland and maritime, because if you go to the bottom of the Royal Mile, the Scottish Parliament, the new Scottish Parliament, is designed on upturned ships because of Scotland's strong connection to the coast and fishing. As you walk up the Royal Mile, you come across Adam Smith's statue, the Wealth of Nations. And I think this conference motto should be Mare Liberum, the free seas. And I think that's more than anything else because some delegates last night found their liberty impinged when the bar closed and they couldn't find a shop to buy wine. And that is because Scottish nationalist politicians who regularly champion the freedom cries of the Braveheart film also enjoy restricting our freedoms on a regular basis. Can I congratulate Andrew and Sonia for their works? Their works are absolutely outstanding. These are outstanding books, and if you don't have them in your collection, please go to purchase these at the break. Both of them weave through complex and compelling personal, local, national and international events, and it's a real honour to share the stage with you both. The second time recently I've shared the stage with Andrew, and that means that my wife is now talking about what's going on, so we have to watch very carefully with that. Can I also, again, just commend Alistair. Alistair's championing of Churchill in Scotland is truly remarkable. His kilted edition of the Scotland version of the Churchill Journal, along with David Freeman and many others, was absolutely splendid. I think a huge round of applause for Alistair. Alistair's return from illness has definitely been helped by the promise of whiskies later on this evening. There's no doubt about that. My short paper today is on Churchill and St Valery, the Churchill Scotland legacy, and whether it was wilderness years, Indian summer, or heroic leader. I want to look at two aspects of his time in Scotland, which gives us an insight to his alleged, and I use that word carefully, alleged love-hate relationship with Scotland, and the evident, and it is evident, love-hate relationship Scotland has with Churchill. I say allegedly for Churchill, as Churchill historiography has entered into much quasi-history, myth, and post-truth narrative. We must thank, and if you don't know these names, please note them and find their work. We must thank Gordon Barclay, Louise Heron, and Adam Brown of the Scottish Military Research Group, who both in print form and their daily Special Operations Executive war on Twitter helped to purge post-truth tripe. And if you go onto Twitter, there is lots of it. Churchill is belittled and regularly misrepresented on social media by Scots, and that then filters into the popular media. Absolutely, Barclay and Heron's recent book has destroyed the myth of tanks on the street in Glasgow and Churchill's direct involvement in that. I guess when you see the Twitter spats, there's lots of cyber sparring. We talked about cyber war earlier. There's lots of cyber sparring, but cyber sparring with the great unthinking gets a bit boring after a while. And we have to be glad that the Twitter inventors came up with the Churchill dictum of brevity and clarity, which helps no end in these wars. Now, Andrew very well cites Gordon Barclay's work in his own book to re-establish what happened in George Square in Glasgow. And he also very helpfly shows the very measured approach Churchill took with striking workers in Dundee. Churchill did not order Black Watch soldiers onto striking workers in Dundee. He did not order the tanks into Glasgow. Quick bit of audience participation before I go to the second part of the presentation. How many here are from England? Hands up. Thank you. How many are from Scotland? Okay, how many are from America? How many are from Ryder Cup winning Europe? And how many are from the rest of the world, areas I've not touched on so far? And I think that is a perfect demonstration of the... Scottish ancestry? Well, we can come to that. We will do. We will come to that. But I think that's a perfect demonstration, that very quick survey there on... we're here at an international conference about somebody who's been described in the opening lecture as the statesman, the main statesman of the age. And we're in Edinburgh. How many Scots are here? That presents a picture. There is an issue related to Scotland and Churchill. Now, it might be worth considering how Scotland's emergent 20th century social justice positioning influenced that. And I could talk at length about the Treaty of Versailles, which was mentioned earlier, but it's one snippet of that which shows there was a shifting in the world, in Dundee, in Scotland, everywhere there was a shifting. There's a little-known Scot who was a delegate at the Treaty of Versailles, and that Scot influenced the International Labour Organisation being formed, the world's biggest trade union. I'll talk to you in the bar about how this farmer from Aberdeenshire ended up at the Treaty of Versailles. But ultimately, there was a shifting, and that impacted on Churchill. There's no doubt about that, and that's very well covered in the book. St Valery, though, is vital. St Valery is a real challenge for us. Often hailed as Scotland's Dunkirk in popular media, that headline misrepresents that most troops got off at Dunkirk, but the Battle of St Valery a few weeks later, in 1940, most did not. Indeed, the majority of the troops ended up in prisoner of war camps for the rest of the war. It was described as Scotland's Flodden, modern-day Flodden, and also it was said that every town and village in the Highland had somebody impacted by the Battle of St Valery. It was that significant. Now, June Goodfield's Glory from Defeat, our second Dunkirk, apart from her misleading title, is an excellent entry point to Dunkirk. And the fact that the 51st Highland Division were left in France and had this disastrous defeat after the evacuations. And historians continue to fight about that today. The 8,000 men captured have become pawns in a historical debate. But I want to slay 5 myths before we go to conversation. 5 myths of St Valery. Myth number 1. The first myth, it was only Scots at St Valery. That's absolute nonsense, and those who put it out know that. Yes, mainly Scottish regiments, but also Norfolks, Northumbrians, Princess Louise, Kensington Regiment, the Middlesex Regiment, and many other UK service regiments were represented. So English, Welsh and Scottish soldiers together. 2, the Highland Division had been placed there as bait and had been sacrificed. Totally untrue. They were 10th in the line on a rotation, and it just happened to be the 51st that were in that position at that time. It could have been anyone who ended up there. The 3rd, they were forgotten. They certainly weren't forgotten because 3,000 were rescued by small boats and craft, like the other evacuations, further up at Ville de Rose. And the last was the allegation that Churchill just didn't care about the evacuation. The truth was, a mass evacuation on a scale like Dunkirk was impossible due to the size of the harbour, fog, and also German artillery shelling. As long as we've got nationalism in Scotland, this dynamic will exist, where we have competing factions toying with truth and ultimately fable. As Churchill said in wartime, truth is so precious, you need to guard it with a bodyguard of lies. But I hope this conference and our discussions over the coming days will put many lies to bed, and I hope many will be inspired to write more about Churchill in Scotland. Can I say finally, cheers to Mr. Churchill in Scotland. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we've had 3 fantastic presentations. We've covered politics, we've covered personal relations, we've touched on military and the war, an awful lot to get into, very little time. But I'm going to go to Alistair for the first question. Does it not come on automatically?
Does it?
Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for your words earlier, and thank you very much to everyone who's taken the time to speak today, and indeed everyone who's come far and wide to join us here today. Scots are pretty adept at cashing in on their history and contributing to a booming tourism trade, and hopefully that makes Edinburgh in particular a welcoming and exciting place. But there is a glaring absence of Mr. Churchill, and his connections are deep and wide, and indeed many are being connected today and joined up, and it's one of the great excitements of exposing that and bringing it to everyone's attention. How would the panel think about, and what needs to be done to make this a seismic moment where Scots widely and generally from schoolboys right through to politicians, they understand and they know that these connections are there. What needs to happen so that Churchill sits right up there with movies or TV shows or great Scottish moments as something that's just recognised?
So for those who didn't hear it, in essence, the question is, what needs to happen to bring Churchill back to Edinburgh? We'll go with Andrew first.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. Very good question. You said you were going to ask a tricky question.
Sorry.
Obviously, I guess a kind of culinary tour of Dundee is probably not the right answer. I think, and Neil actually will be able to speak on this more than me, but I think ultimately, and it's not just the case in this instance, but in most instances, these things come down to education. And I think that particularly when we're thinking about Churchill and his relationship with Scotland and how we can make that more recognised and given the prominence it deserves, we need to start with children and young people and making sure that they are taught facts, yes, exactly, the truth, exactly, rather than mythologized a version of events, which I think is often what happens at the moment.
Okay, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. I've written down 3 things: physical, education, and research. And I guess touch on all of them. There is an interest. I had the privilege of chairing the 2020 80th commemorations for St. Valerie. And as you know, we had to flip that because of COVID. And our global reach online for that was 167.6 million people. So there is an interest in it if you can harness the communications. I do think there's a physical element. I think you need to, as you know, the work I did with the war poets of the First World War, we put plaques all around Scotland to help to draw attention to war poets who, everyone thought that the war poets of the First World War were English, but there was many excellent Scottish war poets. So you need a physical presence. And I think the statue that we've just seen, how wonderful would it be if out of this conference we had a physical presence, or we had a commitment to do something here. Education, absolutely. There's so much mythology. We need to get it into the curriculum. I'm, goodness, in year 4 now of my fight with SQA, the Scottish Qualifications Authority, to add in 2 words to the curriculum alongside Dunkirk. And the 2 words, St. Valerie. What does it take to put it in? But there's a political element to that within the education system. And the last is research. We need to continue evolving. Andrew has set the gauntlet for all his stories. It's a tremendous work. But now, I'm sure he would agree that the whole purpose of the book is to get more people researching and more people finding out more. So I think physical education and more research, Alistair.
Sonia, does bringing in Clementine help bring?
Well, I think it does. I was going to say I really believe in
if you could speak.
Sorry, I really believe in the educational aspect of this and how important that is. But also, I think we mustn't forget, and I think sometimes this does get forgotten, that Churchill was a human being with relationships and feelings and connections and loyalties. And he clearly did have a great connection, personal connection with Dundee. I remember my own education at school here in Britain, that Churchill wasn't really a human being. He was sort of, he was like a thing that stood up against Hitler and did stuff in the Second World War, but we never found out about him as a person. And I think that's a great mistake. And I think the more that you find out about him as a person, actually, the more likeable he is. And I think if we taught the Second World War and his role in it a bit differently, I think then this kind of political revulsion some people are taught to have for him would dissipate, because actually he is a likeable person with his flaws, but that is actually quite empathetic the more you get to know him. And I think that does come down to education.
Okay. Do we have further questions? It's the lady up here.
You mentioned the possibility of a statue. I want to nominate a statue. I was in Kansas City recently. I don't know if there's anyone here from Kansas City, Missouri. And I walked out of the hotel. I was there for an event of the Truman Library, which is a wonderful institution. And there, right on the street, is this life-size statue called Married Love of Clementine and Churchill. And I think that it's a copy of a statue that was done that's now at Blenheim Palace, I think. But you should bring that statue here.
If I could interrupt just a moment, Alan.
Yeah.
We are in Edinburgh. One of the finest paintings or portraits of Winston Churchill ever done from life is right here in Edinburgh at the National Portrait Gallery. And so I urge you to go over there to the top floor. You'll find him right between Andrew Carnegie and Sir James Barry. The portrait was actually a study that was done in preparation for a much larger work, Statesmen of the Great War, which you'll find at the National Portrait Gallery in London, which Catherine Carter will be happy to tell you all about.
Okay, and of course, Churchill College in Cambridge has a copy of the famous Orpen portrait from a time when Churchill was MP for Dundee. So hopefully some of you will be able to come and see that when you come and visit me. But further comments on sort of representations of Churchill in art and statues? Andrew, did you want to come in on this one?
Yes, I was just going to come in and say, if any of you do have a chance to visit Dundee while you're here, there is some commemoration of Churchill's time as MP for Dundee. There's a plaque that was put up by a group of Dundonians in 2008 to mark 100 years since Churchill's first victory. And actually, if you go to the Queen's Hotel, they, in a rather good-natured, I think, act of self-depreciation, have put up a copy of Churchill's letter to Clementine complaining about the food. So there are some things you can see there as well.
Yeah. I was going to remind folks of exactly the same. The position of the plaque's interesting. The position, it's not the greatest location for people to get to, and I guess, you know, it's great there is a plaque, but it's interesting where it's been located, which is always, you know, for people to actually access and see it. I think I've laid down the challenge now of a statue, just in terms of where would you put the statue. The picture of Edinburgh, I mean, Princes Street Gardens would be a wonderful place to have it. Dundee would be a good place, and we talk a lot about perceptions of Churchill. He obviously changes through history, but the real grasp of, you know, how was Churchill received is in the picture. 1945, you know, thousands coming to see him. The following year in Aberdeen, he was a rector at Aberdeen University in the First World War, and he went back to Aberdeen in 1946. Crowds came out and cheered ecstatically for St Valery and for Churchill. Now, if anyone knows Aberdonians, get Aberdonians to cheer ecstatically about anything is a remarkable feat. But they did. They warmed him so much, and they gave him a Burgess title, of which I'm a proud member, and they gave him an honorary degree. So there's lots of different locations. Balmoral would be another one. I have a paper I'm working on just now in terms of his relationship with the Queen and royalty. There's lots and lots of places where we could really well mark Churchill in Scotland.
Okay, Sonia?
I think I really like this idea of the two of them together. I think, you know, particularly in Scotland, because of Clementine's Scottish heritage, that seems to me, you know, to make that permanent emotional, real link with Scotland would be a great idea. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, well, we haven't got very much more time, and I think there's a key question which I think I would like to put to all of our panellists now. And that is, we've been focusing largely on Churchill's early career, his more formative years when he was MP for Dundee, his early relationship with Clementine. And I just wanted to ask you, how do you each feel that those experiences, that relationship, went on to shape Churchill as a later Prime Minister and war leader? Sonia, perhaps we start with you.
Well, I think, I mean, his relationship with Clementine was hugely important during the war. Even if you look at those famous speeches, it was very much her idea that he would use simple language, simple words that anyone with even just an elementary education would understand without having to look it up in the dictionary. Again, because I think she understood what it was like out there, you know. And I think it would have been impossible for victory to have come without that sense that we were all in it together. I know that's become a cliche now, but it was very important. And Clementine had this huge mailbag from just everyday members of the public during the war about one instance, just to tell you, is a lot of people in air raid shelters were worried about their children, obviously being very scared. And Clementine arranged, I think it was 1 million or 2 million beds to be manufactured, folding beds that you could unfold during a raid for a parent to sleep alongside their child. When you think about the thoughtfulness of that, but also the practicality, it wasn't just that she had the thought, she made it happen. And it wasn't that she ever crossed Churchill or tried to duplicate what he was doing. She tried to always to be complementary to what he was doing. So I think that sense that she had from the outside world, from Scotland, from the rest of her childhood, informed his entire career, including during those crucial war years where I think, you look how polarised society is now, how we don't seem to be able to sort of cleave together anymore, but he managed to bring us together as a nation and the alliance together to fight that war. And I think she was a large part of that, and her founding years here helped shape her in that way.
Okay, Neil?
We talked this morning over breakfast about nuanced leadership, and I think there is something where it became more nuanced. I think it's easy to pigeonhole Churchill and that sort of Thomas Carlyle, the 19th century Scottish writer on leadership, about the sort of great man leadership theory. But actually, he was more complex than that, and he was more subtle than that. Yeah. And that subtlety and that nuance, I really think, came from his time in Dundee. I think he saw things he hadn't seen before. He gained an empathy and an understanding which remained with him all the way through. So not only was his experience in Dundee letting him see different things, but it was starting to shape him as a man and as a leader and how he acted. And we talked a lot about how Clemmy's influence on that. Clemmy was really influential in him understanding poverty and understanding the challenges that workers were going through. It was a different man that came out of Dundee. And I think if he hadn't had Dundee, he might have been a very different leader.
And not as good.
Mm. Yes, yeah, I'd agree with both what Neil and Sonia have said. I think the other thing that Churchill definitely got out of his experience in Dundee, I think, were the kind of values of endurance and perseverance. I think if you think back to 1908, he wrote to his mother when he was selected and said, it described Dundee as a life seat, cheap and easy beyond all reason. And of course, but he wasn't wrong to say that then. Of course, it was a very safe, the seat that Churchill was contesting was a very safe Liberal seat, but of course, events and circumstances changed, and of course it turned out not to be the case. But I think that experience of defeat in 1922 helped Churchill understand the importance of keeping going in the face of setbacks, and indeed is one of the reasons why he was such a capable and determined opponent of appeasement in the 1930s, and indeed such a great war leader that we all owe so much to.
Okay, well, thank you. We must also keep going, and I'm conscious that it is now lunchtime. Let me end with a quote, and it's from the speech that Churchill made, which Scott alluded to earlier, on accepting the freedom of the city of Edinburgh on the 12th of October, 1942, 81 years ago next week. And that was, by the way, the very first freedom of any city that he accepted. And of course, it was still at a very early stage in the war. We hadn't yet had the victory at El Alamein. And what you may not know about Churchill is that he was a great fan of music hall. And one of his favourite music hall artists was the Scottish artist Harry Lauder. And at the end of accepting the freedom, Churchill ends his speech, "Let me end with the words of your famous minstrel, words which have given comfort and renewed strength to many a hardened heart. Keep right on to the end of the road, keep right on to the end." So on that, can you join me in thanking our wonderful panel?